I'm Sean Waters. I'm a biogeochemist and I come from a geology background. My first degree was in geology. And geochemists study essentially the chemistry of earth reactions and rocks, water and atmosphere, all of those reactions. And they're reasonably key because they mediate a lot of the cycles that we sustain life, the carbon cycle and the phosphorus cycle and the nitrogen cycle. All of those are mediated by chemical reactions, essentially. And a lot of those chemical reactions are mediated by things like bacteria, and hence the biogeochemistry. And my speciality, I tend to look at phosphorus cycling and nutrient cycling more broadly in freshwater lake systems. Phosphorus ends up in the lake system from lots of different sources. There's what we call the external load, which comes out of the catchment. So that might be, it will come naturally from the erosion of rocks, which contain phosphorus minerals like apatite and things. And the erosion of those rocks ends up creating sediment, which is transported into the lakes. But it's also comes in from artificially applied fertilisers or the breakdown of organic material. There's some deposition from the atmosphere. So there's a whole bunch of sources that contribute to phosphorus that end up in the lake but come out of the catchment. And then once they get into the lake, phosphorus tends to like to be bound to bits of sediment and particle. And so when it gets in the lake, it often settles out into the bottom, and it can either become locked up in the sediment, and that's quite a good thing, but sometimes there's some processes in the lake that go on that can return that sediment in a dissolved form, which is then available for algae and plants and the life in the lake. It can return that from the sediment, and we call that internal loading. And so if we think of the primary productivity or the growth of plants and algae and things in the water column as a little electric motor, then we have an external power source to the catchment, and we have a little source in the sediment, which might be our battery source. So lots of lake restoration projects look to control the inputs from the catchment, which is fantastic because that needs to be our first step. But when you pull that external power source, the lake often resorts to an internal power source or the battery, and the nutrients come out of the sediment and keep fueling that algal blooms or the excess growth in the lake. And we often have this really long lag time for lake restoration projects, which is obviously undesirable because we want quick results. Phosphorus is obviously a naturally occurring element, and we all need it in our bodies, and all the plants and algae in the lake and the fish in the lake, everything needs phosphorus to mediate life. And so there is a natural resource that comes into the lake which will, I guess the lake will be in balance, and so the amount of nutrient coming in will be balanced with the life that's growing in the lake, and then organic decomposition as stuff dies and settles, and a healthy lake will have a natural balance where all of those things are in rough equilibrium. When we start chopping down the catchment, chopping down the trees in the catchment, we increase our sediment load. When we apply lots of fertilisers onto the land, we increase nutrient load, and so suddenly we're supplying more nutrient than the lake can naturally sustain. And so organisms in the lake that have a natural advantage and can suck up that nutrient really quickly, like algae, they tend to get out of control, and then they start to dominate. We get algal blooms in the lakes, and they dominate, and some of the natural plants like macrophytes, which are rooted in the sediment and maybe native to the lake, they start to get shaded out, or they get algae growing on top of them, and so they start to die, and we lose the macrophyte forests, if you like, in the lake, which provide lots of habitat for the zooplankton, the little critters in the lake, and the fish and the tuna. And so everything gets out of balance, and we end up with a turbid lake that's dominated completely by undesirable excess levels of algae. which then gets into a cycle because that starts to die and we get this massive load of dead organic material down the bottom sitting on the lake sediment, and that starts to consume oxygen in the bottom of the lake, and that, we're going to get complex here, but that starts to essentially dissolve iron minerals which tend to bind phosphorus, and so then we get a return of phosphorus back to the water column, which fuels more algal growth. And so we get into the cycle of excess algal growth, big dissolved oxygen consumption in the bottom, more phosphorus comes out of the sediment, and so on and on it goes. And so the normal plants that are growing in a balanced system don't stand a chance when these very thick algal blooms are out competing them in the lake water column. In terms of lake restoration and trying to break that cycle of excess productivity, our first step needs to be stopping nutrients coming into the lake, so the external load from the catchment, and we can do that by reforesting or anything that reduces erosion, because phosphorus is transported primarily on sediment, although there is some dissolved transport as well. So planting the catchment, reforesting the catchment, reducing superphosphate application to sustainable levels, and then once we've got that, if we have a degraded lake system that is cycling nutrients internally, then we have a few options. We can either wait, and it may be multiple decades for the lake to start to get back into balance, and the lake will flush some of those nutrients out slowly. Or there are some ways we can intervene. We can put in oxygen bubblers or aerators that mix the lake and stop the bottom becoming so depleted in dissolved oxygen. Or we can get more extreme and start to add chemical agents which bind phosphorus into the lake in a way that can't be recycled. And so that can be contentious, because obviously we don't like throwing excessive chemicals in there that we prefer not to be putting into lake systems, but there is plenty of successful restorations that have used that approach. Yeah, or we can manipulate things like fish, because again the food web has a massive impact on the nutrient cycling. Lots of introduced fish species will graze the little beasties that in turn graze the algae, and so if we have lots of what we call zooplankton, which control the algal levels, if you remove those by putting in fish that eat them, then again the algae can get out of control, and so you tip this system into out of balance. Another approach is introducing some fish species which might eat your zooplankton grazers, or trying to take out the zooplankton grazing fish out of the lake. So that's more of a biological control, I guess. So the water quality in Lake Wairarapa is very poor and degraded, but when we look at the components of that, so there's sort of four classic components that we look at, which is a total nitrogen, much of which will be in a dissolved form, but not all of it. There's the chlorophyll A, which is a measure of the algal or phytoplankton productivity in the lake, in the water column. Then there's total phosphorus, which is the nutrient we've been talking about, and Secchi disk, which is a measure of clarity. And so in Wairarapa, Lake Wairarapa, the two that are particularly elevated are the Secchi disk, so we have very low clarity, and the total phosphorus, which is a measure of essentially a measure of the resuspended sediment. So in Lake Wairarapa, a big part of the problem is a light issue almost rather than a nutrient. The nutrients are elevated, but the light is a real problem because it's very shallow and it's very big, and so the waves, you get a lot of area of the wind blowing across it to create waves and resuspend that sediment. And then the rooted plants, the macrophytes, have essentially collapsed in the lake, and the only macrophytes, I think we have 1% cover of macrophyte plants in the lake now, and they tend to be very tiny little turf communities just on the edge that get wetted and dried and wetted and dried. And so there's very little plant habitat in the lake for the fish and the tuna and zooplankton and things to hide in and live in. One of the things we were interested in is, well, if we can control sediment and phosphorus coming into the lake, is in Lake Wairarapa, is there a big reservoir of phosphorus in the lake bed sediments that may get recycled as we start to get the catchment load under control? And when we actually looked at the phosphorus in the sediment, there actually isn't that much stored in there. It seems like most of it's being recycled in the water column and slowly flushed out because my guess is that because the resuspension happens so much, it doesn't get a chance for the organic load to settle in the sediment. That doesn't create oxygen sags, and we don't get into that cycle of phosphorus loading from the sediment quite so much. And so that's a real positive. We don't have that battery. If we manage to pull the external power source out of our little primary productivity motor, we won't have this battery that may fuel ongoing algal problems in the lake. Having said that, controlling the sediment and phosphorus coming in is going to be a big ask, because that's a whole catchment problem. Much of the catchment is deforested, so there's trees missing right from up in the headwaters of many of the rivers, and they're all transporting big loads of sediment down the catchment, some of which is ending up in Lake Wairarapa. One of the suggestions has been to increase the depth of Lake Wairarapa as a way of trying to reduce suspended sediment and increase the light environment and hopefully bring some macrophytes back. And that definitely has some potential. I guess my concern is all of these interventions often have some unintended consequences, and my concern is that if we make it too deep without first controlling the sediment and things that is coming in, then we may increase the likelihood that or the frequency with which we get an undisturbed water column, and hence we do start to get some of these low dissolved oxygen events which can occur in some of these shallow lakes, often over quite short periods. And so that there is the potential to start to tip the lake into an internal nutrient loading cycle. Whether that would actually happen is very hard to tell until we do it, but I'm reasonably firmly of the opinion that we need to get control of the things that are coming into the lake before we try and deal with stuff with the lake itself. And that may include planting all around the lake, so the riparian planting around the lake, trying to control nutrients and sediment there, and trying to control it from further up the catchment as well. Wetlands are obviously really important in this environment. They almost act as a filter, and so nutrients coming into the wetlands in water have a chance to be settled out and taken up by plants and cycled in a reasonably balanced way before things get into the lake. And so that's, a lot of money gets spent on reconstructed wetlands, but often we've had very effective natural wetlands around these shallow lake systems that do that service for us naturally, and so restoring them is, I think, a very important approach, and not draining any more. We've drained an enormous percentage of our wetlands in this country, and it certainly hasn't helped our water quality issues. So I'm a critical step leader for the Lakes 380 project, and the step that we're working on is trying to establish some indices from the sediment at the top of the core, so the top couple of centimetres of sediment in the lake bed, trying to work out whether that can give us some indicators about contemporary water quality. So at the moment, if we want to get a snapshot of lake water quality, we tend to rely on regular monitoring by councils or volunteer groups or whoever, but you need a long time frame and it's very resource intensive. So they may be sampling in some cases weekly, but more frequently monthly or quarterly, and we may need 5 years of sample collection before we get a really good comprehensive picture of what the water quality is like in that lake system. Our hope is that by sampling right across the country and right across gradients of water quality and gradients of lake type and altitude and latitude, then we can develop an indice. And so we're taking samples for DNA and pigments, which are essentially what the algae and phytoplankton that's settling out, they leave their pigments in the sediment, and so we're sampling that, and we're sampling the geochemistry, so the metal contents and the nutrient contents, and in particular the phosphorus and how the phosphorus is bound in the sediment. And we're hoping that with a nationwide data set across these gradients, we can come up with an indice that you can basically go in and take a very quick sample of surface sediment, the top couple of centimetres, and go, okay, the last 10 years or a reasonable time frame is the water quality has been X, has been eutrophic or degraded, or it's been oligotrophic for a long time. So that's the hope, because we think the top few centimetres is essentially has integrated a number of years of processes in the water column, and so should provide us a snapshot of essentially our 5-year monitoring program that we might do traditionally. Yeah. In New Zealand, we've traditionally liked to think of ourselves as a very clean, green country, and there are large parts of our country that are like that, but there's an increasing number of, as we're becoming more aware, an increasing number of our waterways are degraded and are in pretty bad shape, and we're having real problems, biodiversity problems with freshwater fish, and probably less studied, but equally zooplankton, the little critters in there that eat algae, and an increasing number of lakes and rivers that are experiencing algal bloom problems and toxic algal blooms. When I was a child, we never heard about that stuff. We swam in all the rivers around the place and didn't even think about it. And I guess, you know, increasingly we're documenting a reasonably rapid decline. It feels like a lot of that stuff has happened quite quickly. And that makes me sad, and it should make our whole country sad. And I think increasingly it is. I think people are realising that, you know, we need to change some of the way we do business in order to slow and halt that decline and start to restore some of our waterways. As a scientist, it's easy to get very focused on your little part of the puzzle and you know, be almost focused on data and spreadsheets and that whole picture. And one of the wonderful things about the Lakes 380 project has been getting out and interacting with some of the communities and the iwi that are intimately connected to some of these lakes that I may know very little about or have had no connection to, and presenting some of the information that we're starting to glean from our work with those people is really valuable, because it reminds you why you do the work and how important some of these lakes are to local communities, both for food and recreation and just for aesthetics and spiritual connection. And so yeah, that's been a really nice part of the project, to see how passionate people are about their local lakes. one of our hopes is that if we manage to develop some useful indices of water quality from the sediment data, is that will enable councils and policymakers to get a real quick snapshot of water quality across a broader data set or across a broader group of lakes than they might have the resources to monitor regularly. Obviously funds are short for everybody, no one wants to pay more rates, and so the councils are stretched in terms of how much monitoring they can do and where they put their resources. So our real hope is that this work will enable a wider view of lakes than are currently being assessed. And on a broader frame, I guess the environmental reconstructions that we can do down the cores will give us some idea of what those lakes were like pre-disturbance, pre-human disturbance, pre-European disturbance, and that gives restoration programs a target to aim for. You know, we can see what sort of vegetation was in the catchment, and so if we're replanting those catchments, what plants should be going back in there? Was the lake reasonably nutrient rich naturally, whether it's because it's very low in the catchment, might have had big seabird populations, yeah, or was it a pristine system before we cut down all the trees and the lake began a sort of trajectory of degradation. So it gives a target for restoration, which is often missing if we don't have that environmental history